Hello and welcome to today's discussion on behalf of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council and the South Asia Center. A very warm welcome to all of you joining. My name is Uzair Yunus and I am the director of the Pakistan Initiative at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. And today we're going to be having a pretty interesting conversation about Pakistan, 75 years of independence, which is what we're celebrating as you watch this and as this conversation goes live on social media. And what can we learn and what have been the key events that perhaps we should draw a few lessons from to chart a better future towards 100 years of independence, which is going to occur in the next 25 years. Joining me for this conversation today is Dr. Ilhan Niaz, a dear friend of mine who's also chair of the history department at the Quaid-e-Azam University. He's the author of several books and academic papers, including the book The State During the British Raj, Imperial Governance in South Asia, 1700 to 1947. And really his work, dives into the long history of South Asia and the Indian subcontinent from the Mughal era, especially during the British Raj, and how governance and the way governance was structured during the British Raj continues to have an impact on the political economy in the region. I would also, just before I hand over the floor to Dr. Ilhan Niaz, congratulate all the people of the subcontinent for this Independence Day. Yes, India and Pakistan have their issues. Yes, there is a lot of polarization and division in the region today, but perhaps we can all look back on our own shared struggle, the shared struggle of our forefathers against an imperial power, against a colonizer, and gaining independence, which in fact it essentially happened on the same day, even though India and Pakistan celebrated on 15th and 14th August respectively. And perhaps Dr. Niaz can tell us a bit about why that is the case and why the dates ended up being changed. So Dr. Niaz, thank you so much for joining us in today's discussion, and welcome to this conversation.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
I want to begin, with perhaps hearing a bit from you on what are the key events in Pakistani history over the last 75 years, or some of the key trends that you've seen that have perhaps contributed to the problems we see in the country today, but also, if solved, can help us chart a better future. Because, as the old saying goes, those who don't understand history are bound to repeat it. So would love you to help our audience understand some of the key trends and themes and events that perhaps they should observe and reflect upon on this Independence Day.
Well, I think if we were to look at the long period of colonial rule leading into the independence of Pakistan and the Pakistan movement that immediately precedes it, the overriding theme would be that the struggle for Pakistan was very much rooted in the development of Muslim modernist thought in South Asia and the resulting political and social reform and action that arose from that thought. And what that thought essentially had argued was that the Muslims had lost power to the British because they had failed to keep up with the knowledge, with the science, with the military arts, and with other important ideological and political developments that had swept through the Western world. And the way in which the Muslims were going to bring about what Jinnah himself referred to as an Islamic Renaissance was through the revival of the secular might of the Muslim world. But in order to do that, it was absolutely essential that the Muslims regain sovereign control over at least the territories where they constituted a demographic majority. And that, of course, set the stage for Muslim separatist discourse during the colonial period, and then ultimately to the demand for a separate Muslim homeland altogether. So the interesting thing is that the demand for Pakistan is in a way situated in a modernist discourse. But what we see happening is that after Pakistan comes into existence, Muslim modernism as a way of thinking, as an approach to government, as an approach towards organizing a society to be globally competitive, gradually withers away. it withers away at the intellectual level, it withers away at the administrative level, it withers away at the economic level and at the social level as well. So we have a very strange thing in a sense that the people who brought about the creation of Pakistan, who were essentially thinking about a non-denominational Muslim modernist state, ended up creating that state and then basically losing control of the narrative and the discourse and the thought processes required to actually construct a modern Muslim polity. And so the history of Pakistan since 1947 is in many ways an amalgam of a kind of regression towards primordial identities, primordial ideologies, and also an attempt to repackage some elements of modernity, but in a very, very religious discourse. So we have a situation where the task of identifying ourselves as a modern nation state, the task of thinking of ourselves as a modern nation state has effectively been abandoned over the past 75 years. So a lot of our subsidiary problems basically are rooted in this crisis of our worldview, in this crisis of our epistemology. And tracking that crisis, of course, is something which historians and social scientists and other people have been doing for the last 75 years, but it doesn't really seem to matter much regarding how well they track it or how well they understand it, because the sort of momentum of our history, unfortunately, appears to be taking us in the opposite direction from where our founders like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan or Allama Iqbal, and certainly the Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah envisaged.
One of the things in sort of, I'm one of those people who, when they're bored, reads a lot of history, and I've gone through the volumes of the Constituent Assembly debates, right? And it struck out to me when I was reading that, particularly when the Objectives Resolution was tabled and passed, that this debate that you're describing between modernity and the role of faith and Islam and religion and what should be the guiding principles occurred at that time. And it stood out to me also in that debate that every single member who was a minority member of the Constituent Assembly, meaning that they were not Muslim, opposed Liaquat Ali Khan's efforts to pass the Objective Resolution, but the majority prevailed. And to me, when I read that, I was like, oh, this is actually where it all began in a way, right? And then as I dive deeper into history, you saw that folks like Muhammad Asad, most Pakistanis don't know anything about him, even though he was one of the key modernist thinkers of his era. Friends with Allama Iqbal played a role in terms of helping Pakistan understand its own modern sort of guiding principles at the very early stages. But then there was a backlash, so to speak, against modernist thought, and most people today don't know about him. What were, and these were just at the very onset, right? And then things with Islamization, Zia, everything else follows. From your point of view as a historian, what were some of these key inflection points where perhaps you think that history could have ended up a bit differently, has certain events gone a different way? Or are you of the opinion that no, it wouldn't have mattered in any case because there were way too many inflection points and just the thrust of majority or the thrust of conservative elements was just so strong that it wouldn't have mattered at the end of the day?
Well, I think that when you're looking back at history, you have the advantage of knowing how things turned out. So it is easy to perhaps criticize the actors at the time for making mistakes, the results of which became evident later. But one of the things that I found when I was at least doing my research was that many of these decisions, you mentioned the Objectives Resolution or the continued use by the Muslim League after independence of religion in politics, many of these problems were actually also identified by people at the time. So reference the debates that you have talked about in the Constituent Assembly. One of the minority members warned that Pakistan was paving the way for the restoration of the divine right of kings by reopening this particular door. And when we go to the 1950s, when you look at the Punjab disturbances of 1953, the anti-Ahmadi agitation of that time, there again, in the year leading up to it, the then Interior Secretary G. Ahmed very, very sternly warned the then Prime Minister Khwaja Nazimuddin that the Muslim League's propensity for essentially playing very clever games with religious sentiment and pandering to what it thought was conservative opinion and Islamic orthodoxy was setting the stage for an uncontrollable descent of Pakistan into what he called primitive conditions. So these things were actually pointed out. And even then, our historical actors at that time, though they were often advised properly, they did not heed that admonishment. And this has been our recurring failure, I would say. And it is not simply a question of inflection points in terms of, where we injected religion into the polity. It's also in terms of inflection points on the economy, on democracy, on administrative reform. I mean, you name it, you literally have a situation where almost every single time Pakistani leaders have been well advised by their own civil servants, by their own advisors that, look, boss, this is not a good idea. We should do this, not this. The leader says that, well, my short-term survival depends on me doing the thing that will turn out bad in the long run. So let me just do what suits me right now, and then we will see what happens later on. And I think that ultimately is Pakistan's great tragedy, that we have had choices. Our current trajectory was not inevitable. There are many countries that started off in a worse position than Pakistan that have done phenomenally better than Pakistan after gaining independence. But our leaders, regardless of the quality of advice that they have received from time to time, have insisted on making unwise short-term decisions. And you see this happening again and again. I mean, it's these days, it's almost comical how every few years, when the government changes, the people who are ousted start criticizing their predecessors for doing the exact same things that they were doing when they were in government. And it's almost as if their memories have been wiped completely clean. So there are plenty of these inflection points. Certainly 1949 is one, 1953 is another, the 1954 and 55 Supreme Court cases that led to the advent of the doctrine of necessity are others. The first military coup in our history is another one. So there's so many of these points. And what is sad about many of these points is that although some perhaps were not avoidable, many were avoidable. And people at that time had actually advised the government of the day to do things that could have avoided the tragic outcomes that we had to contend with.
One of the things that you've written about, talked about, you and I have talked about this previously as well, is sort of the lasting legacy of the extractive colonial setup, right? And particularly in modern day Pakistan. Yes, it existed in India as well. And on top of that, you layer on the fact that this was, particularly the Northwest was the region where the British were playing their great game with the Russians. They had two Anglo-Afghan wars, smaller campaigns against tribes in what is today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, used to be also part of FATA. What has been the legacy of this extractive setup, this sort of consistent sort of dominance of the military bureaucracy that the British left behind in 1947, but that continues to have an impact on Pakistan's own political economy, particularly, as you mentioned, it has had an economic fallout in terms of creating what I continuously refer to as a kleptocratic economy. But, obviously it didn't come out of nowhere. So I would love for you to share a bit about what life used to be like, how the British structured this state, and how we inherited something that continues to this day.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that many of the territories that became part of Pakistan were not militarized or bureaucratized necessarily just by the British. they were also the frontier zone for the Mughal Empire. They were also host to a range of other smaller, less successful kingdoms and empires, including the Sikh kingdom of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And these polities were traditionally dominated by their military elites. So in that context, Pakistan being dominated by its military elite with the bureaucracy or civil servants playing second fiddle is not something that started with colonial rule. It is something that goes far, far further back in our historical experience. The important thing, of course, is that notwithstanding the fact that the Punjab was one of the main recruitment grounds for the British Indian Army, and the British had an extensive network of military land settlements and frontier defenses to protect their empire. The overall control of the military forces in colonial rule lay with the civilian leadership. So when Pakistan becomes independent, our leaders, like India's leaders, inherit that colonial mantle of civilian control over the armed forces. The difference, of course, is that in India, they are able to retain it and to a large extent even strengthen it after independence. And in Pakistan, we are not able to retain it. In fact, we very quickly revert to a kind of Khalsa Raj sort of model of governance, where the army and its favored bureaucrats and political stooges are controlling the political system or trying to control the political system as best as they can. So that is sort of a complicated, a little more complicated than a simple linear pegging all of that problem on the colonial period. But I will definitely say this, that Pakistan does inherit disproportionately a large military service class. And that large military service class in the Punjab and also partly in KP remains a very strong source of support, not only for military rule, but also for other types of authoritarian tendencies and authoritarian experiments that civilian rulers have opted for from time to time. So that authoritarian constituency, if you will, as a social group, is definitely inherited from the colonial period. But sadly, that authoritarian tendency goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years.
That's very interesting and fascinating in terms of, how much of an impact this history continues to have on the country and the region that we inhabit. And of course, we're seeing some of these tendencies across the region, right? Pakistan and the world in a way. I refer to this as the pandemic of populism and authoritarianism that's continuing to engulf the world around us. And it is something that perhaps we ought to have a longer conversation on as well. I have one of your papers that you published on Jinnah on governance. Obviously, 14th August, one of the things that you see on social media, publications inside and outside of Pakistan talking about Pakistan is about, Jinnah's speeches that he gave. He obviously did not live long enough to fully articulate, what he meant with and wanted to do with Pakistan, but then there is enough material there for us to get a very good sense of what he wanted to achieve. And you've written about this, right? I would just read a quote from towards the end of this paper where you write, quote, "If Jinnah were to examine Pakistan today, he would find a militarized, quasi-theocratic state with a criminalized and barely functional democracy, grappling unsuccessfully with national problems through a depleted and politicized civil service that lacked the ability to implement policies that could pull Pakistan out of semi-industrialized stagnation, bring peace to its violent society, or begin correcting the effects of a dangerously imbalanced demographic profile." That's a pretty dark view of where Pakistan stands today and how far it stands from Jinnah's own vision. In your view, if you've studied Jinnah and what he wanted to achieve on the civil bureaucracy side, on the armed forces side, industrialization, etc., what are some of the steps that perhaps we can begin taking today so that, hopefully both you and I are alive when Pakistan reaches its 100th independence, and we can say that, you know what, Dr. Niaz wrote this paper and we talked about Jinnah's vision and how far away we were. Perhaps we're closer to it 25 years from now than we were today. What would it take to realize that vision?
Well, I mean, what you're asking is something which falls beyond the scope of historical analysis, which is normally not prescriptive in nature, regarding what we can do to pull ourselves out of this decaying orbit, if you will. There are any number of things that we can recommend, not necessarily things that I have thought of, but our archives are littered with good advice from all sorts of people who would know far better than I would about what to do specifically in a specific case. But our problem has always been that there is simply not enough political buy-in on any major issue to push through critical reforms. And this is what you see on administrative reform. This is what you see on the economy. This is what you see on, practically every major issue that we face, whether it's, population planning or population welfare or any other such particular thing. So in Pakistan, I fear that our great challenge is to try to figure out how can we actually get that critical mass on the political front on any of these issues. And what I unfortunately see is, especially over the last 10, 15 years, is that our political discourse has become so polarized and so binary in nature that having a serious conversation about nearly any issue from a political platform is next to impossible. That our politics is essentially a shouting match and an insult match between different groups. And those groups, of course, some may be a little bit more polite than others, some may be a bit more crass than others, but they ultimately all devolve into the same type of mudslinging and mutual recriminations. So that, I'm afraid, is a problem which defies academic analysis. It is not something which any academic can actually come up with a plan about how you can polarize your political discourse to the point where serious conversations can start to be held. Now, even if such serious conversations can start to be held, you still have the problem of having an economy that is so depleted that whatever little scope there might be for innovation or enterprise is essentially strangled by structural adjustment. It is strangled by the fact that whatever room a government might have for maneuver is subject to the constraints imposed upon it in order to avoid imminent default. Structural default, of course, being, as we've discussed earlier, another problem. But our goal is to just avoid imminent default. And then as soon as we've avoided that imminent default, we revert to doing what we were doing earlier, which is giving freebies to our political constituencies, squeezing the people that already pay the taxes, and essentially waiting for our tenure to run out so we can hand over the keys to somebody else who will then repeat the exact same thing. So the thing is that, as an academic, I'm not really in the hope business. I'm in the analysis business. It's not my job to, give people hope or to take it away. But I do think that if we were to rationally diagnose our problems, and if our leaders were to apply some of their minds to these problems, we could possibly start doing a lot better. And that is something, again, which requires a political change. It requires thinking in the political parties, in the political leaderships that, look, we are headed towards a point of institutional and economic exhaustion. In order for Imran Khan or Shehbaz Sharif to be prime minister, you need a somewhat functional Pakistan for them to be the prime minister of. So in the interests of having a state to somewhat mismanage or loot or plunder or whatever, you need that kleptocratic or that populist impulse to be moderated by a sense of keeping the source of their power and wealth going. And that is also a level of enlightenment that appears to elude our political class. And in our political class, mind you, I don't include simply the politicians. You would also have to include the military and the bureaucrats and other people that are also very important political actors.
So one of the things, what you said resonates with me, and I've been over the last few months throughout this unfolding crisis and political and economic crisis in Pakistan, have been sort of asking some of these political actors or people close to these political actors, right, making the same point that you're at the brink of exhaustion and collapse, right? You need a new need to chart a new path forward, so to speak. And one of the things that I consistently hear from these actors or elites in general is that, well, you are, I think, being too alarmist. We've seen such crises before. The 90s were polarizing times as well. Look what happened in the run up to 1971. And after that, look what happened before that, even in terms of the riots and the looting and the arson that occurred in the years following independence. And so this is nothing too out of the ordinary. You're a historian, you've looked at these eras in very much detail. Help me sort of, rebut this point that I frequently hear from Pakistanis, especially elite Pakistanis close to the political system, that it is not as bad as people are making it out to be, because we've been in far worse situations in the past and we came out all right out of that.
Well, I suppose it depends on how you define all right. But if we look at Pakistan's initial crisis, that posed by partition and the refugee crisis and by the war with India over Kashmir, what we find is an amazingly resilient state machinery that is able to restore the functioning of the government with almost astonishing speed over the territories that Pakistan inherits. And it does so with only a small number of trained civil servants of a senior level, and of course, under the leadership of Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan. So yes, of course, we faced a terrible crisis at the time of independence, but that crisis was also then met with a very effective response. Obviously, that response left in its wake certain unresolved problems, and it was the responsibility perhaps of later generations of statesmen to resolve those problems, which they did not, but that's a separate story altogether. The other thing is that between 1947 and 1955, Pakistan survived without any external assistance. All of that institutional development that we did on the economic front, on the bureaucratic front, even on the political and the legal front, such as the abolition of the permanent settlement in East Bengal, East Pakistan, all of that was done by your own government, absent any external support. And it was done under the most trying circumstances that were imaginable. Then, of course, when you look at the East Pakistan crisis, I mean, again, I don't really understand how anyone can say that, we came out of that crisis all right, because Pakistan lost more than half actually of its population in that crisis. The majority seceded from the minority. It left us with a chronic set of economic and political and administrative problems that we have not been able to tackle till date. And that secession of East Pakistan was a massive, massive political failure that was precisely due to this type of, inertia-oriented thinking that, the East Pakistanis will never actually seek independence from us. There's no problem over here. We'll give them a few, extra jobs in the civil service and everything will be all right. Look at our overall GDP growth rate. Things are going great, so on and so forth. The typical thinking of the Ayub era West Pakistani elite, which then lands us in the secession of East Pakistan. And unfortunately, like a gambler that doubles their bets after every time they lose, these elites seem to then fall into the same pattern that, oh, well, because, my life is getting a lot better and I'm very well connected and I'm doing great. So the country is doing all right too. And yes, of course, there'll be inflation, there'll be poverty, there'll be chaos, there'll periodically be outbursts of violence. But, look at how resilient we are. Look at how we bounce back every single time and how Pakistan manages to survive. So that narrative, I think, is something which our elite, which our official propaganda does, like to sell. But the trouble, of course, is that success or failure is always relative to other societies in your own period of time. So while there is no doubt that Pakistan should perhaps pat itself on the back for having, staggered through 75 years, the problem arises that there are so many other countries, as I mentioned earlier, who have inherited far worse situations from their colonial masters, who experienced far more violence and instability in the aftermath of colonial rule relative to their populations, and who nonetheless were able to establish the parameters of a policy framework that has led them, if not to complete development or industrialization, certainly to a decent upper middle income quality of life for their people. So that comparison then sees us in a situation where today Pakistan is essentially running out of countries to fall behind. And that is something which should get us to stop being so complacent about our predicament. Yes, Pakistan has survived, and that is something which the elites might want to take credit for. But I would basically say that Pakistan has survived in spite of its elites, not because of its elites. And if the elites don't understand that, then sadly, they are essentially presiding over the eventual liquidation of the country that they draw their identity and their resources from.
And I think that's the real fear, right? And to me, at least in my conversations, I don't see that recognition, and that is a huge red flag in my book as well, because time is surely running out. And again, as you said, other countries have fared much better in worse circumstances. And the stat that I often give to Pakistanis is that in 1990, the GDP per capita of Pakistan was higher than China's. Today, 30% of Pakistan's debt is owed to China, and the tables have in a way reversed, because the Chinese have followed a consistent policy of developing, industrializing, lifting people out of poverty. And yes, you can have arguments about what the Chinese system is like, and communism and Chinese Communist Party and things like that. But the end product is that people are living much better lives in China than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that is a testament to the success of their policies. Another thing that I frequently hear from people, and it continues to be part of the popular discourse and debate in Pakistan, is what sort of system should govern the country. 75 years later, I think a lot of us are still having this debate and trying to figure out whether the 18th Amendment was right, whether a constitutional parliamentary democracy is the right path forward, or there should be a presidential democracy. From a historical perspective, tell us a bit about why and how this debate emerged in Pakistan, and what was Jinnah's own vision about the governance system in Pakistan, and is, in your view, this debate, how damaging has been this debate or these continued experiments in Pakistan about presidential systems, parliamentary democracy, military rule, etc. And how do we even bring this debate to a close? What did Jinnah want?
Well, I think that fundamentally, Jinnah wanted a parliamentary democracy with a relatively strong central government that would have the ability to push through the type of reforms that were required to bring about the modernization of the country. Of course, he did not articulate the details of this proposal. That was the task of the Constituent Assembly. And it was their job to actually fill in the blanks and figure out what type of constitutional structure would best achieve this end. Pakistan has paid an enormous price for its continued attempts to tamper with this basic understanding of a parliamentary democracy as a form of government. And this is something which we have seen happen in the 1950s, when you have the military and the civil service indirectly trying to, interfere in the parliamentary process in order to manufacture pliable politicians and majorities behind which the military and the bureaucracy can continue to rule. We see this happening, of course, under Sadr Ayyub and his presidential system, which is basically the presidential system that exists in the minds of elite Pakistanis when they think of a presidential system. I don't think they're actually thinking about a US-style presidential system where you have checks and balances and, I would say even more chance of gridlock than in a parliamentary system where the legislature and the executive would automatically come from the same party. So that has cost us a lot. And it has cost us a lot in terms of continuity of policies, in the sense of implementation of development programs seriously. It has perhaps prevented our political leaders from taking a more longer term view about the country's problems. And it has produced a very, very unhealthy and toxic kind of political competition in which the rules of the game are never really agreed upon, and a kind of pure power politics in which no holds are barred plays out between different political actors, in which whatever political actor ends up losing claims that they have lost as the result of a conspiracy or as the result of rigging, and whichever political actor wins claims that, well, now they have some sort of divine mandate to turn Pakistan into some sort of Islamic emirate. So that problem in our system, that instability, is something that we have paid a tremendous price for. And I would basically say that as long as we continue to mess with that constitutional structure, the country will continue to spend most of its time and energy on these essentially unconstructive political conflicts between segments of the elite that can then rotate into and out of office in different alignments. And the rest of the population will continue to be neglected as far as their real interests or their real improvement in their quality of life is concerned. When it comes to the form of government that suits us best, I think a lot of that depends upon historical conditioning. You mentioned China earlier. When we look at East Asian societies, if you look at, let's say, Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, you have three very high quality democracies. And if you look at, let's say, countries like China or Vietnam or Singapore, you have three very high quality autocracies. So in the context of East Asian societies, in many of their cases, that society has a choice between a high quality dictatorship or a high quality democracy. In our part of the world, unfortunately, the historical legacy of our governance is that our choice is between a bad autocracy and a bad democracy. And given a choice between a bad autocracy and a bad democracy is preferable, because it at least allows for some measure of corrective, whereas a bad autocracy would basically set the stage for extremely violent upheaval, the kind of upheaval we actually saw tear Pakistan apart in the separation of East Pakistan. So I think that if these are the choices before us, not exactly inspiring choices. So, I'm not an ideologue or a proponent for any particular form of government, but I would say this, that in our context, given these choices, the option of a bad democracy is preferable to a bad autocracy. Some of our would-be autocrats, of course, might delude themselves into thinking that if they come to power and have autocratic authority, then they will somehow be able to wield that in order to rapidly modernize the country. And that, of course, is the dream of our presidential system advocates. But we have tried authoritarian rule several times, and each time it has ended in disaster. And it has left in its wake a ruinous legacy in the form of secession, in the form of radicalization, in the form of terrorist violence. And none of these authoritarian regimes have been able to put Pakistan on the path of sustainable economic development or industrial takeoff.
I often joke with my friends that you put it a lot more in a lot better words than I do. I just joke that Pakistan did not even get the right type of dictators in its history, and that's also part of the tragedy, is that the system and the legacy of colonialism, etc., on one side, like the dictators that came, also couldn't last for more than 8-7 years at a time, and had to leave because they were just incompetent in terms of controlling the country. And of course, the legacy of Ayub's presidential system, which I agree with you, is the dream of elites in Pakistan. They forget that a few years later, it led to the secession of East Pakistan and created what is Bangladesh today. And I think we should take some lessons out of that experience, given the insurgencies, given the violence and the lack of inclusion in Balochistan and parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, even parts of rural Sindh, for that matter, or South Punjab. That if you bring and repeat this type of experiment again, then the result may be another Bangladesh-like scenario. Of course, when you raise this point with, again, at least I raised this point with elites, they just brush it aside, saying Pakistan is not East Pakistan, which as if that's some sort of like deep analysis that they've conducted. Last question that I have for you, Dr. Niaz. Of course, you look at historical data, conduct historical analysis. In that analysis, it's obviously the 75th birthday of the country. The median age of the country is about 24, 25 years, meaning that most Pakistanis were not even alive when General Musharraf was beginning his rule over the country, or they were just in their diapers at that time. When you look back at history, are there any silver linings? Are there any things that perhaps we can look at and draw inspiration from, that you would say, for this emerging generation of Pakistanis, draw inspiration from these events or the role these particular players played? And perhaps if you can scale up that type of, the type of decisions they made, or follow their example, then perhaps the next 25 years won't be more muddling along, so to speak. And I would love for our conversation to end on that hopeful note. So would love your thoughts on, when you look back at 75 years of history, what are some events that you look at and draw inspiration from?
Well, I mean, if you insist on, pointing to specific, let's say, developments that are inspiring or do represent a major national achievement, I think most Pakistanis would point to the nuclear program, and that Pakistan becoming a nuclear power is something which is obviously very rare in the global perspective, and it is something which gives Pakistan a strategic weight that is well beyond what its economic indicators would otherwise merit. And that is something which Pakistanis would, I would say, justly feel very, very proud of. Of course, when you talk about those athletes, I think those athletes at the Commonwealth Games, or indeed in other instances as well, they often succeeded without any government support. Very often they had to basically do everything on their own. And this is something which, of course, I see in many young people at our higher education institutions, at our universities, including the Quaid-e-Azam University, where younger people are, I think, no longer waiting for the government to intervene to help them out. They're trying to do as best as they can in order to make things better. So a good example of this is that at the Quaid-e-Azam University, our students have started teaching for free kids that are going to school in the adjoining government schools. And the reason that they do so, of course, is to help those kids recover from the effect of the education or lack of education they're getting in those government schools. So you have this perhaps desire to help each other out. And that desire to help each other out is something which you will find across the length and breadth of Pakistan. Pakistanis donate to charity at levels that are comparable to industrialized countries. And that is perhaps one of the important reasons why Pakistan still continues to function, continues to have a certain level of social and economic stability, but that galvanizing force in the form of a state that comes in and actually organizes collective responses to collective problems, that is eluding us. And getting that traction is something which is extremely important if the next 25 years are to be better than the previous 25 years, or indeed the previous 75 years. So again, I'm very sorry that you basically invited the wrong person for the sort of hope vibe, but that is perhaps as cautiously hopeful as one can be under the circumstances that we are facing. And that hope, of course, is one that ought to be grounded not in some kind of delusion about where we stand, but in a kind of grim determination that we have to get better, and we have to make Pakistan a better version of itself for all of our sakes.
No, I still believe I invited the right person, because my view is that if we don't diagnose the problems from our own history as Pakistanis, then the solutions will always not present themselves, and we will continue to repeat the mistakes. So I always enjoy having these discussions with you, because I get to learn a lot. I'm sure our audience got to learn a lot about Pakistan, its history, why we are where we are from a historical context. So appreciate you taking out the time. And I would end on that hopeful note of younger Pakistanis taking matters into their own hands. I think we, again, from a grounded reality perspective, there are some rays of hope. It's not galvanized to a point where you have like a youth movement, something like what we saw recently in Chile, for example, which elected one of the world's, or the youngest leader in the world, 36 or 37-year-old president. We don't have that yet. But there is that potential to happen. And my message to younger Pakistanis always is that they ought to trust themselves, and not the gray-haired men who do backroom drawing room deals, no matter what party or institution they belong to. And perhaps that is the way to galvanize that instinct that is emerging in the country. So Dr. Niaz, thank you so much for taking out the time today and joining us for this discussion. Hopefully you'll enjoy the holidays, and then we'll have you on for another discussion in the near future. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.